Welcome back. What does it mean to be authentically Muslim but deeply rooted in Western culture? People often assume that Islam is something foreign and that to be Muslim, you have to adopt Middle Eastern or South Asian culture. Sometimes we hear calls for Muslims to fully integrate into Western culture to prove that they truly belong. Do Muslims in the West need to establish their own identity and distinguish themselves from their fellow Muslims in the East? What should Western Islam look like? Today, we hear from a man whose work explores this very issue. Dr. Abdal Hakim Murad, born Timothy Winter, is Dean of the Cambridge Muslim College and a lecturer in Islamic Studies at Cambridge University's Faculty of Divinity. He sat down with us during his visit to Toronto for the Reviving the Islamic Spirit Knowledge Retreat to tell us about the aims of the Cambridge Muslim College and to talk about what Indigenous British Muslimness might look like. Let's take a look.
Well, we found ourselves in the British Muslim context confronted with a certain disconnect between, on the one hand, the very substantive demography of our community. According to the most recent census, the proportion of Muslims in Britain went up by 60% just in the last 10 years. It's a large community with over 2,000 mosques nationally and counting, representing really a microcosm of the entire Muslim world. And on the other hand, a host community that historically in an island nation has been quite insular. Britain is not, unlike, say, Canada, historically a country that has constituted itself as a melting pot of a large number of migrants who've come seeking economic betterment. It has been more static than that. And as such, the responsibility of creating a proper mutually fertile relationship between what is indigenous and particular and that which is specific to the worldview of these migrant communities has become one of the most important cultural and political challenges facing the national conversation at the moment. So the function of the Cambridge Muslim College is to create a space that is academically rigorous, because we draw on the resources of the University of Cambridge and other important institutions, that is a place where Muslims of a traditional formation, graduates of traditional Islamic universities and seminaries in different parts of the United Kingdom, can experience the modern reality at first hand. So physicists will explain to them about the Big Bang, about string theory, about new ideas of causation, about the problems of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and the challenges that science proposes not just to the religious mind, but to humanity in general. They will learn about other religions from the practitioners of those religions. They will learn about modern thought, because all too often we find that we have religious leaders who may live their whole lives in a Western context, but they don't really know what the West is. They don't know what its religious history is. They don't know what has made it what it is, what its strengths might be, what its weaknesses might be. They don't really understand the economic situation, the governmental, the legal situation. And this makes them rather bad cultural mediators and therefore rather bad religious leaders. So we think that the time has come, now that the first generation has created the basic infrastructure of mosques in England, to perform the more challenging task of seeing what voices are being heard from the pulpits of the mosques, to make sure that a discourse is emerging that's both fully faithful to the specifics of the classical Muslim tradition and also makes sense in the context of how people are thinking in the reality of modern Britain, or the modern Britons, because of course it's an increasingly diverse and multicultural society. So essentially what we do is imam training. They come to Cambridge having graduated from their Islamic colleges, and we give them one intensive year of learning about what the modern world is about. But we also have a research program, and we're developing also a program for a BA in Islamic Studies, so people who don't have a basic background in Islamic Studies but may have trained as medics or engineers or have done degrees in English literature can come and can be qualified as Muslim scholars, because with the implosion of so many Middle Eastern countries now, it's increasingly difficult for young British Muslims to go abroad in order to study Islam. And I think that the success of Muslim communities in Western countries really is predicated on the development of indigenous local forms of authentic training to a high standard in the Islamic sciences, because the future of the traditional Islamic cities and their institutions, is something that regrettably is now very much in doubt. Although the college is primarily committed to the delivery of teaching in a fairly traditional classroom mode, we also recognise the reality of the modern world, which is that many people prefer to or have to learn virtually. And so we have recently launched an online series of lectures which in the first instance is based around the curriculum that Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh in the 11th century of the Common Era is proposing in his great magisterial work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. And this is divided into 40 books, and they go through really the whole of the religion, so from ideas of epistemology and knowledge to what the doctrines of the religion are, through how to pray, and ending with things like repentance, love of God, gratitude to God, the mystical virtues, the remembrance of death. All of the religion really is covered there. And each of these 40 chapters is given a specific lecture, which is more than an hour long, and there are study notes, and people can download these. And because it's a charitable not-for-profit scheme, every penny of the money that people pay to download these lectures goes to the charity which is creating the new mosque in Cambridge. And there's other features available on the website as well. So even though I'm rather old-fashioned in my ideas about pedagogy and education, I think this is our window into the wider world. So it's not just British Muslims who will be benefiting, but anybody who speaks English. And we also have lectures available in Spanish as well, and in future we hope in other Western languages. Well, we are often told, sometimes by politicians in a slightly anxious or even bullying tone of voice, that we need to be clear about what our identity might be and our belongingness or appurtenance to the countries in which we live. This demand is often made in a rather shrill way, but is often difficult of execution because there are so many deep questions about what Western identity is. What is it to belong to the West? Are there not millions of different ways of being Western? What is it to be British, for instance? What is it to be Canadian? What is it to be Australian? What do you have to be in your lifestyle in order to have an identity that's particular to one of the Western democracies? And it's by no means clear what constitutes Britishness. What do you have to be or think, or how do you have to behave in order to be considered to be British? By no means clear. 50 years ago, it was very clear what an Englishman was. You might listen to Vaughan Williams and smoke a pipe and wear a duffel coat and know the names of battleships, and it was a particular human type that everybody in the world recognised. Nowadays, nobody's really clear what it is that an Englishman or a woman might be. So the demand for creating, say, a British Muslim identity is one that is very vehemently made, but is probably an impossible one, because these Western identities are in a process of very rapid fading and fragmentation in the face not of the arrival of Muslims, but of globalization. Nonetheless, it is the case from the perspective of Muslim communities that the religion is not an undifferentiated Arabness, but that in fact has historically represented the process of the florescence of a wide variety of different cultures. So the Turkish style of religion has a particular identity to it, which is very different. The Indonesian style is different to the Chinese Muslim style, different to the life of traditional religious Uzbeks, and so on. The Muslim world is a rainbow of different ways of being true to the prophetic message. And even though a certain contemporary, if you like, fundamentalism tends to promote a sort of Arabness as being the essence of the religion, in fact that's not required in the classical texts of the tradition at all. It's a kind of identity politics that I think is generally negative and imposes on people an additional duty at a time when they already have enough on their plates. So in the British context, although it's impossible for the local population to define what Britishness is, as Muslims we have to define what it is, because everybody has a particular modality of being religious. And it's clear that you can't be, in the long term, in Britain and still be an Arab Muslim or a Malay Muslim or a Bangladeshi Muslim. The first generation will be like that. Second generation will be in a state of confusion, caught between the three worlds of Britain and Bangladesh and Islam, and they go through all kinds of ethnic traumas as a result. But subsequently, there has to be something that's local and indigenous. And the emergence of that is already evident, and it's quite exciting in many ways, but it's something that I think we need to avoid over-defining. It's more a kind of fragrance or an atmosphere than an ideology or a checklist of criteria for membership. I think such restrictive and prescriptive forms of defining belongingness to host societies are impossible and potentially exclusionary and have to be avoided at all costs. There is a rather tenuous but nonetheless identifiable strand of indigenous British Muslimness that goes back a long way. There were Muslims from Britain, for instance, at the time of the Crusades, knights who converted to Islam. In the later Middle Ages, there were British people who became Muslim. At the time of the Barbary Corsairs in North Africa in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, a large number of British sailors became Muslim. Some of them came back to England, some of them were executed, some of them managed to maintain their faith in the teeth of opposition from the churchmen of the time. But it's in the 19th century that we start to see significant and sustainable convert communities as opposed to individuals in various English market towns and secretly practicing the rituals of Islam. And for those who are interested in proposing a model of belongingness simultaneously to Islam and to the local narrative, those small communities which emerged really in the late Victorian period provide a suggestive hint of what it is to have roots that are local rather than roots that are elsewhere. This is particularly important in terms of the need to refute the rhetoric of the far right and their idea that Muslims always belong to some exotic Oriental elsewhere and can never fully participate in the life of their adopted countries. There is an indigenous style of Muslimness in Britain that goes back at least 100, 130, 140 years, that produced poetry, that produced songs, that produced idioms of Muslimness that in many ways were more integrated, more imaginative and more creative than what many of the communities are doing now. So there is this book, the British Muslim Songbook, which I have produced, various other productions that seek not to impose a particular model about how British Muslims ought to be, but rather to broaden the bandwidth, as it were, of cultural options that are available to Muslims who see their future as being within the British Isles, to remind the community that there are indigenous resources as well as imported resources for accessing the sacred, that the English language has tremendous resources for the conveyance of morality, beauty and the sacred, which Muslims as yet are only just beginning to tap, and that this vein, although thin, is nonetheless a vein that ought to be mined and quarried by Muslims as they seek to define this ultimately I think will always be a rather nebulous reality of a British Muslim identity. So it's by way of a cultural experiment, I would say, rather than an ideological imposition of a particular modality of how Muslims ought to be in this new and in many ways quite challenging cultural environment.
Hearken, come hearken, a prophet is born, with a hungry stand for the tyrant. La ilaha illallah, the one, the true, the great. To Muslims the guiding star, the one, the true, the great. To Muslims the guiding star.